let the sheNEDigans begin. Long live the sheNEDigans.
Hello, welcome to the topic of this video. As always, let's talk some sheNEDigans. So, when I was a kid, one of my favorite subjects was ancient history. And out of all the cultures and time periods that I studied, my favorite culture and time period to study was ancient Egypt. I loved everything to do about ancient Egypt. It was a really mysterious time to study because although there's a lot of ancient artifacts that have been dug up, a lot of mummies, and a lot of other aspects which have been discovered about ancient Egypt, it is still a very mysterious time period, which is why I think it really appeals to me, because there's a lot of theorizing, there's a lot of things which you can kind of assume about the culture and basically everything that has to do with it, especially its mythology, which I find to be at least a little bit interesting. One of the things I loved to do as a kid was actually trying to write hieroglyphics. I studied hieroglyphics a little bit when I was a kid, and I can't remember them for the life of me today, but yeah, I used to actually try to write my own like stories and sentences and stuff like that in hieroglyphics. I was a weird kid. My love of ancient Egypt definitely translated over into the realm of film. Now, out of all of the cultures and mythologies that have been represented in film, I would argue Egyptian culture and mythology kind of got the lower end of the stick for a multitude of reasons. When you think of movies on mythology, some of the first things that you usually think of are Greek or Roman, Hercules, Clash of the Titans, Jason and the Argonauts, and then you have Norse mythology. When you think of like Thor, Odin, and stuff like that. Not a lot of people really think about Egyptian mythology. Honestly, I think the most that Egyptian culture has really been represented in film is mainly with mummy movies. A lot of mummy movies. Mainly, the most famous ones are the Universal monsters with, the mummy. That's arguably the most famous one. Now, there have been other times when Egypt has been represented, such as in Old British Murder Mysteries, which took around the time period when there were a lot of archaeological digs, and some murder would happen, and then like someone like Poirot or something like that, or someone like that would have to investigate the murder among all of these ancient ruins and stuff like that. It was kind of cool. I really liked a lot of those stories. And then, of course, like I said, there are the mummy movies, which I really love. And there are even a few other movies which, are kind of odd. I like them, but yeah, like I said, a little bit odd. There's the Stargate movie, which, wound up creating its own giant television series. There's also Gods of Egypt, which I'll talk a little bit later down in the video. But other than that, they're not really memorable in comparison to some of like the Greek and Roman stories, or even like the stories of Norse mythology. I would argue another story which is told time and time again are the Moses Exodus story. That one's told a lot, as well as the story about Cleopatra, which that one's more so a mixture of Egyptian history as well as Roman history. So I guess the question I'm asking here is, why does Hollywood not really have that much interest in Egyptian stories in comparison to the many other mythologies or other time periods in history? And I think I have a few answers. The first main answer I would argue is there are a lack of stories, which it's really quite a shame because, I mean, I think there are quite a few good stories that you could tell about ancient Egypt, but unfortunately a lot of these historical stories are missing a ton of puzzle pieces, which is really quite a shame because today's culture knows a lot about the Romans or the Greeks and a lot of the emperors and people who, you know, reigned the land and stuff like that. But with Egypt, it's a lot more mysterious because although there is so much that we have found out through archaeological digs, through a lot of, you know, just putting a lot of pieces of history together and stuff like that, there's still a lot missing. And I find that very, very interesting, to be completely honest, especially with its mythology. Now, we know a lot of the Egyptian gods, but we don't know a lot of their stories. There are a few stories here and there which have been pieced together, but in the grand scheme of, let's go ahead and say the Greek gods, everyone knows a lot of the Greek stories when it comes to mythology. They know a lot of the shenanigans the gods got up to, along with mortals, or just you know, the things that the both gods fighting with each other and stuff like that. There are a ton of stories with Greek and Norse mythology that have been figured out in comparison to Egyptian mythology, which is why I think there aren't really many Egyptian mythological stories. I mean, the only one that I haven't been able to find is Gods of Egypt. I'm sure there might be more out there, but this is really the only one that I can think of, at least at the top of my head. And Gods of Egypt is not necessarily one of the best examples that you want to go to when it comes to Egyptian mythology. Not because it's necessarily a bad story, although it kind of is a bad story, but also it's not really represented properly, as there were a lot of actors in it who, although did a fine job, I would argue ethnically were not the right choices. Gerard Butler playing Set, as cool as that is, I don't think is the most technically appropriate. So yeah, that's one of the big things that the movie got a lot of flack for, because it wasn't represented properly. So because of that, because of the lack of stories with Egyptian mythology, all we really have are a ton of mummy movies. Now, the most famous mummy movies are the Universal monsters, such as the ones with Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney Jr., eventually the Brendan Fraser mummy movies, and, well, the Tom Cruise one. So, I would argue that one's more infamous at this point, but will eventually be forgotten. Then there's Hammer with Christopher Lee. That was, their mummy movie was really, really good. And then there's a bunch of, well, just low-budget knockoff mummy movies, which they're fine in their own regard, but I mean, Frankenstein versus the Mummy, like, oh, who on earth would watch that? I would. But yeah, so there's a lot of just like, there's not really a lot of representation when it comes to Egyptian mythology, except with mummies, and I don't get it. Don't get me wrong, I love mummy movies. I think, like, out of all, like, the horror aspects when it comes to mythological stuff, I love mummy movies. I love them a lot, especially because I love ancient Egypt. But it's just weird that that's all we got. You know, all we got were mummy movies from ancient Egypt. I mean, yes, like I said, we do have Stargate and Gods of Egypt, but as I mentioned before, either those have some controversy around them, or they're fun and all, but not great quality, especially in comparison to a lot of the movies which are based on Greek or Roman or Norse mythology. So, yeah, that's all we really got. I mean, the only other aspect of ancient Egypt really being represented when it comes to its stories, more so history, was Assassin's Creed Origins, which is actually my favorite out of all the Assassin's Creed games. I know a lot of people probably don't consider it the best one, but I love it. I thought it was a really great story, especially interacting with a lot of historical figures at that time period, especially like Cleopatra and whatnot. So it's a lot of fun to play, at least in my opinion. And then of course, it's just because it's set in Egypt, automatically it's a win for me. I mean, yeah, how many other games can you ride around on a camel and literally fight on camelback? So that, I would argue, is definitely one of the really big reasons. Just lack of stories overall. The second reason, I would argue, is, well, lack of interest. I would argue, other than the fact that it was just not a good movie, because there aren't really a lot of people as interested anymore in ancient Egypt as there was. I would probably say the latest was maybe the 90s. I think there was definitely still a decent amount of people who were interested in Egyptian mythology, at least with mummies, back in the 90s, maybe some of the early 2000s. After that, though, I think things started to wane a little bit. And then, the peak of that, the peak of interest with Egyptian mythology was definitely in the 40s. And a little bit later on. But that's just because there was still some digs, still some stuff that was happening around during this time period. After some time started to go on, the Egyptian government started to get a little bit more strict when it came to its preservation. So there's a lot of reasons why there has just been such a lack of interest when it comes to ancient Egypt. So honestly, I think that's obviously the biggest reason why Hollywood hasn't touched Egypt for a while. And that's because, there's a lack of interest. A lot of people aren't really interested in Egypt right now. A lot of people are more interested in, currently Norse, but that's just because of Thor from the Marvel movies. To a certain degree, I would argue that there's still a decent amount of Roman and Greek movies that are coming out once in a great while. Not really that recent that I can think of at the top of my head, but definitely a lot more recent than Egypt. I can say that much. So, yeah, honestly, those are really the only two big reasons why I think that Egyptian movies, especially Egyptian mythology, is not really being made that much today. There's just not that much of an interest. And then on top of that, the biggest reason is there's just not that many stories. I mean, there are, but there's, as I mentioned, there are way too many puzzle pieces missing from these stories in comparison to practically everything else. And we can romanticize a lot of those stories, and we can make up a lot of those stories. But if we are going to dive back into Egyptian mythology or Egyptian storytelling, we have to get it right on a lot of elements. We definitely have to get the right actors, the right storytellers, and a lot of really good quality stuff going into these movies. Because although I love a lot of the movies that were made back in the day that did have to do with ancient Egypt, I think that they're good quality because you had to put good quality into that kind of stuff. But today, if there was to ever be a resurgence, you need to really throw in a decent amount of money at it with good actors, good storytellers, good costume designers, just good overall good everything. And I really just don't see Hollywood doing that, which is a shame because I love ancient Egypt. I love everything to do about ancient Egypt, which is why, I try to find weird random mummy movies from time to time, like Day of the Mummy. It's literally a first-person movie. It's actually one of the first-person movies. Which I find very interesting. That's a movie I'll have to talk about sometime. But yeah, my love of ancient Egypt will never go away. I always have these. I can always visit it in Assassin's Creed Origins, as I said before. And yeah, That's basically it. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I know it's a little bit of an odd topic, especially a very random topic, but I'm very interested. What do you guys think? Do you guys love anything to do about ancient Egypt, Egyptian mythology? What do you think some of your reasons why Hollywood isn't making any movies based on ancient Egypt or Egyptian mythology? I'd really love to hear some of your thoughts in the comment section below. Make sure you leave some. I'll definitely be reading them. But yeah, that's basically it. So thank you so much for watching. Make sure, if you're new to the channel, that you guys subscribe. We are getting so close to 1,000 subscribers, and I'm very happy that we've gotten this far. And if you guys can help support the channel in that way, I would greatly appreciate that. And make sure that you like the video. And on top of that, also make sure that you follow us on social media with Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And last but not least, if you guys can support us on Patreon, I would greatly appreciate it. If you guys can't, though, I completely understand. So, you guys have a great rest of your week. I'll see you guys in some future videos as the week goes on and stuff. Take care.